Excellencies, colleagues, dear friends, on behalf of the Permanent Mission of Israel and the Permanent Mission of the United States, I am delighted to welcome you at the event 1975-2025, Confronting Racism and Antisemitism at the UN, commemorating the UNGA adoption of the Resolution 3379 in 1975. We're very pleased that you join us today for this important discussion that aims to shed light on the history of the Resolution 3379, highlighting its lasting impact despite the revocation of 1991, and reaffirm our joint commitment to confronting racism and antisemitism in all their forms. With that, I give the floor to Ambassador Daniel Meron, Permanent Representative of Israel to the UN in Geneva.
Thank you very much. Thank you all who joined us here in Geneva, and thank you all for joining us from around the world on this live broadcast. Colleagues, friends, 50 years ago, the institution where we find ourselves today, the United Nations, took a step that marked a profound moral failure, one whose echoes we still feel today. In 1975, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 3379, declaring that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. With that document, the inalienable right of the Jewish people to self-determination was cast in doubt. The movement, born out of our people's millennia-long yearning for return to safety and sovereignty, was defamed. And the institution that confirmed and supported the Zionist aspiration itself through the adoption of Resolution 181 deeply wounded its own credibility and legitimacy. This was not merely a distortion of history, it was a distortion of truth and morality. Zionism, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, is woven into our very identity, in our prayers, our songs, our scriptures, and our history. It re-emerged in the late 19th century as a direct response to persecution, to centuries of exile, discrimination, ultimately the ashes of the Holocaust. I am a Zionist. I was born out of Israel, and I was very lucky to be born to a family of Zionists, and we moved to Israel when I was a young boy. To label Zionism as racism was to deny Jews the very right to self-determination that this body recognizes for every other people. It was to turn victims of racism into its false perpetrators. The consequences were far-reaching and devastating. That resolution did not fight racism, yet it fueled it. It emboldened extremists, legitimized hatred, and provided ideological cover for the oldest hatred known to humanity. It planted seeds of hostility that continue to bear poisonous fruit today in the streets, on university campuses, across the digital world, and here at the UN. There's a lot of talk these days here in Geneva and in New York of reforming the UN and reforming the human rights bodies. But hardly no one is talking about reforming the way Israel is treated here at the UN. Why is nobody talking about the inflated number of resolutions condemning Israel? Why is no one talking about the multiple special sessions and huge number of reports discussing Israel? Why is no one talking about the special item 7, which is the only country-specific item at the Human Rights Council, singling out one country? Why is no one talking about the UN mechanisms and mandate holders that demonize and attempted to legitimize Israel with no repercussions from the UN system? When it comes to Israel, there is sadly a parallel universe at the UN of hypocrisy and hypercriticism that applies to no other country in the world. I accuse the UN of singling out and demonizing Israel. I accuse the UN of having a bias and double standard when it comes to Israel. Zionism is racism is a moral inversion that distorted the very meaning of racism by equating the Jewish people's national liberation movement with racial supremacy, the UN in 1975 turned truth on its head. History teaches us that incitement, once unleashed, is not easily contained. This week, we met here in Geneva at the old synagogue, at the Bet Yaakov synagogue. Thank you to the World Jewish Congress for arranging this with the Jewish community. And we commemorated Kristallnacht, the night of 1938 November pogroms, whereby Jewish stores and synagogues across Nazi Germany were destroyed, looted, Jews detained and murdered. In 1938, Nazi propaganda dehumanized Jews through radio broadcasts and newspapers. That rhetoric paved the way for the pogroms. Recently, and even more since October 7th, we witnessed the same dehumanization spread with terrifying speed across social media. Millions of posts recycling old conspiracies with modern language, denying the Holocaust, calling for violence, and equating Zionism with evil. And one of the key sources of language and sentiment enabling this hatred are representatives of the UN rights mechanisms, those, and you know who I'm talking about, that without shame of recognition of the impact, directly legitimize spreading misinformation and hatred against Israel. One of those UN rapporteurs even called for the unseating of Israel from the UN. No repercussions to that rapporteur. In times like this, all the more important is to recognize the courage of those who stand with us against anti-Semitism. Many of them are in the room here today, representatives of friendly countries. It is also a time of hope for peace and security in the Middle East, and that we pray for the success of implementing President Trump's peace plan for Gaza. This is an example of productive peacemaking. As Israel carries out the honorable chair of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, in 2025, under the theme Crossroads of Generations, we carry forward the task of remembrance and education. Our commitment is clear: to preserve the truth of the Shoah, to confront denial and distortion, and all kinds of anti-Semitism wherever they appear, and to defend the right of all peoples, including the Jewish people, to live in peace, security, and dignity, free from hate and persecution. Anti-Zionism is racism. It is the modern-day disguise of anti-Semitism in all its ugliness. Chaim Herzog, in his 1975 speech against the resolution of Zionism equals racism, Resolution 3379, said, "The Jewish people will not be deterred or diverted from the realization of the age-old dream which Zionism presents, the right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own faith in their own sovereign state of Israel." Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. We will now hear a special video message from President of Israel, Isaac Herzog.
Daniel Meron, Excellencies, distinguished representatives, dear friends, 50 years ago, on November 10th, 1975, my late father, Chaim Herzog, of blessed memory, as Israel's ambassador in the United Nations, stood before the UN General Assembly to respond to Resolution 3379, which declared that Zionism is racism. I vividly recall my father describing to me that day the tension in the hall, the sense, on the one hand, of standing alone, but on the other, of representing not just the state of Israel, but the past, present, and future generations of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. My late father rejected that despicable resolution, calling Zionism, as he said, one of the most stirring and constructive national movements in human history. And in a gesture that became a symbol of moral clarity, he tore that shameful resolution to pieces in front of the family of nations, declaring that it was the United Nations itself that stood accused. Resolution 3379 was ultimately revoked. Yet 50 years later, its spirit still echoes in the corridors of the UN, in the double standards applied only to Israel, in countless debates, commissions, and special agenda items that single out the world's only Jewish state, and in the anti-Semitic demonization barely hidden behind the language of human rights. We've all seen clearly how anti-Semitic lies spread swiftly, from international forums to parliaments, campuses, city streets, and of course, the digital sphere. We've seen how quickly anti-Semitic rhetoric becomes anti-Semitic actions. And we have seen it show up as a terror against Jews and Jewish targets in Israel and throughout the world. It is a trend that has only intensified since the barbaric attack of Hamas on October 7th. And it is one that has touched Jews throughout the world deeply. We insist now, as my late father did then, we are proud to be Zionists, proud to belong to that remarkable group of human beings. They were those who were brutalized, assaulted, and kidnapped. They were Zionists. They are those who ran to the front lines at first call to protect and defend others. They were Zionists. They are those who show up for one another in countless ways. They are Zionists. And those who continue to show up now to build and rebuild with a deep faith in life and a spirit that will not submit. Ladies and gentlemen, under Israel's presidency of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance this year, we renew our pledge and collective commitment to confront anti-Semitism in all its forms, whether it is being spread by a diplomat at the United Nations or a social media influencer online. The IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism offers vital guidance for recognizing how the world's oldest disease and hatred manifests today. We call on every member state and international organization to adopt and actively implement this definition so that the United Nations, as institution that grew on the ashes of World War II and the hateful ideology that fueled it, never again becomes a platform for hate against the Jewish people. We further call on every member state to apply every form of leverage to bring about the release of every last hostage for dignified burial and eternal rest. I take this opportunity to thank Israel's mission to the UN in Geneva, Ambassador Daniel Meron, and all of Israel's diplomats, allies, and friends and supporters. I thank you for your tireless work to counter anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and to share the truth about the state and people of Israel. May this gathering strengthen our shared resolve to confront anti-Semitism, defend truth, and uphold the ideas upon which the UN was founded. Thank you very much, and together may we all go from strength to strength. Ambassador Daniel Meron, Excellency.
After this passionate message, I am honored to give the floor to Ms. Mireille Zieseniss, Acting Deputy Chief of Mission of the Permanent Mission of the United States to the UN. Ms. Zieseniss, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and good morning. And thank you to Ambassador Meron and to our panelists here today for collaborating in co-hosting this very important conversation, joining us in Geneva to address pervasive and resurgent anti-Semitism, particularly within the UN system. As we've heard, UN General Assembly Resolution 3379, which wrongly declared that Zionism is a form of racism, was a symbolic assault on the Jewish people and the legitimacy of the State of Israel. The adoption of this anti-Semitic resolution marked an unfortunate chapter in UN history, undermining the organization's founding principles. Then, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, warned in his remarks that about the resolution that, quote, a great evil has been loosed upon the world. Though it was indeed revoked in 1991, the resolution's impact, including the establishment of anti-Israel bodies within the UN system, reverberates to this day, emboldening those who seek to delegitimize Israel and marginalize Jewish communities worldwide. In the words of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, there can be no compromise with anti-Semitism. In the UN context, as we've heard, anti-Semitism, which is among the world's oldest hatreds, hides behind a veneer of commissions, rapporteurs, expert reports, and biased agenda items and resolutions that disproportionately single out Israel year after year. Ancient prejudices are perpetuated, masquerading as criticism of Israel. This distortion of legitimate discourse must be confronted head-on, and that is one of the reasons that we are all here today. The United Nations, founded on the principles of peace, equality, and human dignity, must be a bulwark against such hatred, not a platform for its proliferation. The infiltration of anti-Semitism into UN institutions is not only a betrayal of the UN's founding ideals, but also a very dangerous precedent that undermines the fight against racism in all forms. The United States stands with Israel and the Jewish people in confronting anti-Semitism. Under President Trump's leadership, the United States is taking real action. We have implemented policies to hold organizations, nations, and individuals accountable for rhetoric and action that fuels hatred. This includes withdrawing from and defunding the Human Rights Council and sanctioning Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese. The United States is proud to be a founding member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which Israel currently leads, and we wholeheartedly support the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. We are also proud to lead the coalition that launched the global guidelines for countering anti-Semitism, introduced in Argentina, and now endorsed by nearly 50 countries and organizations, including, most recently, Switzerland and Panama. These tools are essential in identifying and combating anti-Semitism wherever it arises. And of course, we remain deeply engaged in bringing peace to the region through the President's 20-point peace plan and sustained advocacy for the Abraham Accords as a pathway to a future of coexistence and mutual prosperity across the Middle East. Above all, however, defeating anti-Semitism requires moral clarity and collective resolve. As we reflect together today on the consequences of Resolution 3379, let us also together recommit to the principles of equality and justice that the UN was founded to uphold. And also together, let us ensure that the words "never again" are not merely a slogan, but a call to action against hatred in all of its forms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Zieseniss. I now give the floor to Dr. Gregory Lafitte, founder of the Forum for Cultural Diplomacy, in cooperation with whom this event came to be. Please.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, Ambassador Meron, Ms. Zieseniss, Mr. Harris, dear David, Professor Troy, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is a great honor to address you this morning. Let me begin by warmly thanking the missions of Israel and the United States and their remarkable teams for their partnership in organizing this truly momentous event. Thank you. As Ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan once reminded us, words matter. They are not just instruments of diplomacy, they are the architecture of our moral world. And when words are twisted, when they are used to wound rather than to heal, institutions suffer, and so does the fabric of our societies. Half a century ago, on the very day of Kristallnacht, as Ambassador Herzog poignantly noted, the word Zionism was wounded at the United Nations. As Moynihan wrote, we should have seen it coming. But we did not yet believe that what was said in these committees would wound history itself. As Bernard Lewis observed, the language itself shifted from racial discrimination to racism and tragically to Zionism, often without even agreeing on what those words meant, as many delegates themselves acknowledged in the debates of 1975. A moral language born from the struggle against Nazism was turned against the people who had suffered most from it. One commentator captured it vividly. To call Zionism a form of racism makes a mockery of the struggle against racism, as Caligula mocked the Roman Senate when he appointed to it his horse. That mockery left a scar, not only on the Jewish people, but on the United Nations itself. Resolution 3379 was not a defense of anti-racism. It was a symptom of deeper illness, a poison that entered our multilateral bloodstream, a disease that still threatens the very fabric of the United Nations. What, after all, were the aims of the sponsors of that resolution? They made it clear, if we listened carefully to what they said. It's to isolate and ultimately to exclude Israel from the United Nations. There is little doubt that some still aspire to that goal. When I began to study this history, I was astonished by how many nations from every region, even from Africa, rose to oppose it. Their words were luminous, dignified, courageous. They saw clearly what was at stake. And yet, I sometimes wonder, if such a resolution were tabled today, would we hear such voices again? For years, I tried to understand how such a thing could have happened. There are in this story a few key places: Kampala, Lima, Mexico City, Geneva, and New York. It was actually here in Geneva that Moynihan first heard of the text coming from Mexico City, the beginning of what he called a moment of infamy. I felt a personal connection to this resolution, as I believe every Jew does. It is rare for an international organization to wound a people so profoundly. I started to understand that this idea was not seeded in New York. It started in Moscow in 1965 and was reignited in Bujumbura in 1973. Resolution 3379, I came to realize, was more than a diplomatic mistake. It was a moral contagion, a virus that infected our multilateral conscience. And although it was repealed in 1991, traces of that poison remained. So why did the Forum for Cultural Diplomacy wish to co-organize this seminar together with the missions of Israel and the United States? Because this history speaks directly to the purpose of cultural diplomacy. What was attacked in 1975 was not a political doctrine. It was the idea that Jewish culture, with its centuries-old attachment to Zion, is something noble. Because Jewish culture is, in its essence, about Zion. To reject the Zionism is, in a sense, to reject Jewish culture itself, to deny the very longing, the spiritual geography that has shaped not only Jewish history, but also the moral imagination of humanity. The United Nations must be reminded of that. If you remove one of the defining threads of the fabric of human culture, you do not strengthen the cloth. You tear it. You are left not with tapestry, but with rags, fragments of meaning that no longer hold together. If the UN truly wishes to confront racism today, it must begin by confronting the antisemitism that still haunts its corridors. Durban in 2001 proved that the virus was not gone. It showed, in fact, how it reappears. And today, as anti-Semitism spreads once again, we must listen to the warning of those who saw it coming, from Herzog to Moynihan to Stefan Lux. This gathering, therefore, is not just a commemoration. It is a call to conscience, to imagination, to courage. How does one truly revoke a resolution? By simply deciding to revoke the determination contained in it? It's necessary, yes, but not enough. The UN cannot simply erase the words of 1975. It must rewrite them. Perhaps the time has come for a new resolution, one that honors Jewish culture instead of shaming it, one that affirms that the fight against racism must begin by confronting anti-Semitism, not by disguising it. If the United Nations does not wish to meet the fate of the League of Nations, it must face this truth. Theodor Herzl dreamed of a world without racism and without anti-Semitism, a world where nations could meet in mutual respect. That dream is not exhausted. It still depends on us, on the words we choose and on the courage with which we speak them. We need more Herzogs, more Moynihans, more Stefan Luxes, and more of many of the ambassadors who spoke in 1975. Because words still matter, and the future of this institution may well depend on how we use them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lafitte. Excellencies, we will now return back in time 50 years and hear an excerpt from the speech of then Ambassador of Israel to the UN in New York, Chaim Herzog, upon the adoption of Resolution 3379.
Over the centuries, it has fallen to the lot of my people to be the testing agent of human decency, the touchstone of civilization, the crucible in which enduring human values are to be tested. A nation's level of humanity could invariably be judged by its behavior towards its Jewish population. It always began with the Jews, but never ended with them. The anti-Jewish pogroms in Tsarist Russia were but the tip of the iceberg, which revealed the inherent rottenness of the regime, which was soon to disappear in the storm of revolution. The anti-Semitic excesses of the Nazis merely foreshadowed the catastrophe which was to befall mankind in Europe. This wicked resolution must sound the alarm for all decent people in the world. The Jewish people as a testing agent has unfortunately never erred. The implications inherent in this shameful move are terrifying indeed. Mr. President, on this issue, the world, as represented in this hall, has divided itself into good and bad, decent and evil, human and debase. We, the Jewish people, will recall in history our gratitude to those nations who stood up and were counted and who refused to support this wicked proposition. I know that this episode will have strengthened the forces of freedom and decency in this world and will have fortified them in their resolve to strengthen the ideals they so value. I know that this episode will have strengthened Zionism as it has weakened the United Nations. Mr. President, as I stand on this rostrum, the long and proud history of my people unravels itself before my inward eye. I see the oppressors of our people over the ages as they pass one after another in evil procession into oblivion. I stand here before you as the representative of a strong and flourishing people which has survived them all and which will survive this shameful exhibition and the proponents of this resolution. I stand here as the representative of a people, one of whose prophets gave to this world the sublime prophecy which animated the founders of this world organization and which graces the entrance to this building: nation shall not lift up sword against nation, nor shall they learn war any more. 3 verses before this, The prophet Isaiah proclaimed, and I quote it in the Hebrew original, Vaya be'achrit hayamim ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. And it shall come to pass in the end of the days, for out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Mr. President, as I stand on this rostrum, the great moments of Jewish history come to mind as I face you, once again outnumbered and the would-be victim of hate, ignorance, and evil. I look back on those great moments. I recall the greatness of a nation which I have the honor to represent in this forum. I am mindful at this moment of the Jewish people throughout the world, wherever they may be it in freedom or in slavery, whose prayers and thoughts are with me at this moment. Mr. President, I stand not here as a supplicant. Vote as your moral conscience dictates to you, for the issue is not Israel or Zionism. The issue is the continued existence of this organization, which has been dragged to its lowest point of discredit by a coalition of despotisms and racists. The vote of each delegation will record in history its country's stand on anti-Semitic racism and anti-Judaism. You yourselves bear the responsibility for your stand before history, for as such will you be viewed in history. But we, the Jewish people, will not forget. For us, the Jewish people, this is but a passing episode in a rich and event-filled history. We put our trust in our providence, in our faith and beliefs, in our time-hallowed tradition, in our striving for social advance and human values, and in our people wherever they may be. For us, the Jewish people, this resolution based on hatred, falsehood, and arrogance is devoid of any moral or legal value. For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such. Thank you, Mr. President. Over the centuries, it has fallen to the lot of my people.
I would like to remark that we are honored to have with us today also the granddaughter of President Chaim Herzog in our event, which is a great honor. To continue our historical insight, I now give the floor to Dr. Gil Troy, historian and professor at the University of McGill, Canada. Please.
Being a Zionist these days, it's kind of lonely, like Ambassador Meron, having chosen to make Aliyah, to move up to Israel and raise my family there. And I speak not just for the Jewish people, not just for liberal Democrats, lowercase l, lowercase d, in a world of increasing totalitarianism, but I speak also for the Israeli soldiers, which include my children, some of whom have served over 400 days in reserves, in a fight against totalitarianism, in a fight that began on October 7th, in its latest round, but of course goes much longer. I'm old enough, and you might be able to detect from my New York accent, as a son of Queens, to have grown up in a world where we worship the United Nations, where the United Nations represented the post-Auschwitz Covenant. The United Nations wasn't just a reflection of American and Western power following World War II, but as we heard, a reflection of American ideals, a reflection that we would not repeat the mistakes of World War I and World War II, that we would not go down the path to nuclear war, that we would not have World War III, and that, yes, we would have never again, that we would never have a Holocaust, that we would never have institutions embracing anti-Semitism. And by the way, in 1975, when this ugly notion of Zionism as racism came down the pike, no one deluded themselves that it was just anti-Zionism and not anti-Semitism. Everyone saw the degree to which singling out Zionism, meaning Jewish nationalism, so central to our identity, was indeed an attack on Jews, Jewish people, Jewish identity. And so in 1975, the covenant was broken. And one of the things I've learned about anti-Semitism is one of the key words that's often missing from definitions of anti-Semitism is the word obsession. Anti-Semitism is an obsession. Anti-Zionism has become a modern obsession. And what do we know from obsession? We put the Jew, as we did in the Middle Ages, and now the Jewish state at the center of all the world's troubles. It becomes, as Bernard Lewis called, Israel becomes the fashionable enemy. Anti-Zionism becomes the omni-cause, in the words of the Free Press. And so, what do you do in that kind of situation? You have to stand up, as you have today, by coming here. One of the most chilling phrases Ambassador Herzog mentioned in his stirring speech was he said Hitler would feel at home in these proceedings that I've witnessed in the UN over the last few months. What a terrible thing. What a terrible betrayal of the UN. We saw it then, and we saw it again on October 7th. I call this the triple double cross. Yes, then and now they betrayed the Jewish people. Unfortunately, that's an old story. The great historian Robert Wistrich called anti-Semitism the longest hatred, the oldest hatred. Unfortunately, they betrayed liberal ideas. That too is now a 50, 60-year-old story. But they also betrayed themselves. The UN betrayed itself. The UN betrayed its founding ideals. And on October 7th, the silence of feminists, Me Too unless you're a Jew, rape is resistance, showed the obsession, showed the willingness to sacrifice your core ideals on the altar of Jew hatred. And this obsession against Israel, against Zionism, against the Jewish people. But we also know that anti-Semitism is not just the longest hatred, but it's the most plastic hatred. It takes on all kinds of forms. We see it today on the far left and on the far right. We see it on attacks on Jews for being too cosmopolitan and too nationalist, for fitting in and standing out. Too much, too much, too much. And yes, we did indeed hear that this attack in November 1975 was an assault on the Jewish people and on Israel and on Zionism and Israel's legitimacy. But it also was an assault on the United States of America and Western ideals. When Daniel Patrick Moynihan arrived in the UN a few months before November 1975, he said, I had no particular tie to Israel. In fact, as an academic, he had never gotten one of those fun trips to Israel, and so it wasn't necessarily close to his heart. He'd had a remarkable career. He'd already served in the Kennedy White House, the Johnson White House, the Nixon White House, and was now serving in the Ford administration, a remarkable display of bipartisanship and of patriotism that we so desperately need today. And he could smell the assault on the Jewish people. This accusation that Zionism is racism as an assault on what he called democracy and decency, as an attempt to humiliate the United States and the West by picking on its smaller ally. And he said, indeed, this shall not stand. He also understood that this was an assault on human rights. He said, if we demean the currency of human rights, if we throw out this word, if we weaponize these words, we'll run out of a popular vocabulary to defend small states and large states, to perpetuate the ideals of the UN. And among his allies those days were many Black Americans who said, if the word racism becomes weaponized and we drain it of its meaning, then how do we make so clear that biologically based bigotry, which is what racism is so unacceptable? Vernon Jordan, at the time the head of the Urban League, said, we blacks, we know code words. And Zionism's racism is a code word. And Moynihan, in his remarkable speech to the United Nations, went into the meaning of the word racism, biologically based bigotry, and went into the meaning of the word Zionism, Jewish nationalism, and noted that because Judaism is this unique mix, Jews confuse. We are a nation and a religion. There's the religion of Judaism and the nation, the people of the Jewish people. And so because of that confusion, or that wonderful fusion, you can convert into the Jewish religion and then join the Jewish people, making Zionism the least blood-based, what he called the most permeable form of nationalism. And yet, in this holy form of nationalisms, one form of nationalism, Jewish nationalism, was singled out. That, he said, was unacceptable. That, his black allies, allies from the right, from the left, union leaders, church leaders, European leaders, Western leaders, all said was unacceptable. Now, we focus so much on Resolution 3379 with its ugly words. And by the way, we were so lucky both to have Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Chaim Herzog, who, with all due respect to many of your impressive resumes, didn't come from the mainstream of the diplomatic world, but both were public intellectuals. And they could see how dangerous it was, as we heard, to inject these ideas into the international bloodstream. And as public intellectuals, they said this cannot just be a battle within the bureaucracy, it also has to be a battle on the streets. And on that day, Resolution 3376 also passed, creating the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of Palestinians. Now, I have never, ever negated the rights of Palestinians. As a nationalist, as a proud Jewish nationalist, as a proud American nationalist, an American historian, I will never negate any other people's sense of self-determination or sense of selfhood, because I know how painful it is when people say, oh, you Jews, you're just a religion. But unfortunately, what happened through that resolution was not just the normalization of hate that we saw in Resolution 3379, but the bureaucratization of hate. And the degree to which this holy institution, this sacred institution, became obsessed with Israel and kept singling out Israel again and again and again from 2015 to 2023. My friend at UN Watch, Hillel Neuer, has pointed out there were 154 anti-Israel resolutions and only 71 resolutions singling out all other countries combined. 154 to 71, obsession. 154 to 71, the triple double cross. 154 to 71, a singling out of the Jewish state, just as the Jew used to be singled out. And indeed, as we heard, it is an inversion, a moral inversion, because Theodor Herzl himself said that part of his dream of establishing a Jewish state, when he launched the Zionist movement formally in 1897, of course, the Zionist idea goes all the way back to the Bible, the notion of the Jews having a homeland, the land of Israel, and being a people, and having rights to establish a state on that homeland. But when Theodor Herzl imagined a Jewish state, he said the excitement, the inspiration of the Jewish state will then lead to the excitement, the inspiration, the liberation of African countries too. Because he understood the interconnectedness of us all. That when words like human rights and racism are demeaned, we all suffer. And when we spread words like freedom, liberty, equality, we all benefit. And that, again, was the defining mission of the UN. Moynihan said, the terrible lie that has been told here today will have terrible consequences. Not only will people begin to say, as indeed they have already begun to say, that the United Nations is a place where lies are told, but far more serious, grave, and perhaps irreparable harm will be done to the cause of human rights. Linking the United Nations with the cause of human rights. and looking at who was behind the resolution. The Palestinians' leading terrorist, Yasser Arafat, the butcher of Uganda, Idi Amin. He said, I'm not going to be defensive. I'm not interested in the accused. I'm interested in the accuser. Let's call out the totalitarian mind. And he said, this resolution reeked of the totalitarian mind, reeked of the totalitarian state. And indeed, it was a Soviet manipulation. He called it the big red lie. But of course, it's emerged as the big red-green lie, as an alliance between the dead Soviet Union, the collapsed Soviet Union, the collapsed communism, and the ongoing Islamist, notice I say Islamist, jihad against the West and against liberal ideas. And he articulated something called Moynihan's Law. He said the volume of complaints about a country's human rights violations is inversely proportional to the actual number of violations. In other words, the more citizens at home can complain about human rights violations, the more human rights they enjoy. And that's why democracies are often on the docket. That's why Israel, the United States of America, so many of your countries are singled out, because we have high standards, and I want us to continue to hold to those high standards. But we also have to call out the hypocrisy and call out the abuse and call out the inversion of words. Words like genocide. And look what happened. 50 years ago, they took the ugliest crime in the human vocabulary at the time, racism, and said Zionism is guilty of racism. And then it became Israel apartheid, especially after Durban. The Durban conference that said, oh, let's bring back that Zionism is racism ideal. Let's hijack a conference that's been established to fight racism, and instead of really doing the work and asking tough questions, let's once again single out the Jews, single out the Jewish state. And then it became settler colonialism, oppressor, and most recently, in a very, very difficult war, but a war where I'm very proud of Israel's attempt to be as moral as possible. And again, I don't compare Israel to totalitarian dictatorships. I don't compare it to Syria. I don't compare it to China. I compare it to the United States of America, to Canada, to the United Kingdom, how they fought in Iraq, how they fought in Afghanistan. And yes, unfortunately, especially in urban warfare, I don't call it collateral damage. I call it civilians are killed. But to take that accusation of genocide and apply it to Israel is, again, an inversion. And what happened? This goes back to the United Nations 50 years ago, because the United Nations created the Rosetta Stone for anti-Semitic anti-Zionism and anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, because the two merged. It created the playbook. It created the precedent for institutions to single out Israel. It created the playbook for uniting on campus, uniting in the media, uniting in the art world against Israel and the Jewish people. It's very easy at this moment, as we're shocked to see anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head yet again, to despair. But I'm an optimist. As a child of America, how can I not be a child of hope? As a Zionist, how can I not be an optimist? Golda Meir said you can't be a Zionist and a pessimist, and I'm a Zionist, so I have to be an optimist. But there also are stories that we can tell, truths from the historical book that show that we're not always paralyzed, we're not always victims. I'm standing next to somebody or sitting next to someone who led the fight, and we'll hear more about that, to repeal this ugly resolution. And indeed, in December 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, because of the fingerprints of the Soviet Union on the original resolution, it was repealed. And I would like to challenge us all to build up to the 35th anniversary of 1991, December 2026, by reading Herzog's speech, by reading Moynihan's speech, by studying what Zionism really means, by studying what human rights really means, by taking back the night, by fixing this organization, by returning it to its core mission, its sacred mission, and learn that when we work together, and it was a remarkable display of bipartisanship, that yes, ugly institutional mistakes, resolutions like that can be repealed. And so we have work to do. And I acknowledge the great gift of your time and of your willingness to stand up. And in the spirit of Chaim Herzog, who said, this piece of paper is not worth the paper it's printed on, we rip up all the resolutions, dozens and dozens of resolutions that have grown in the last 50 years. And we say, that shall not stand. The Jewish people are not on trial. The United Nations is on trial. And you have the opportunity to redeem it. You have the opportunity to bring it back to its core mission. You have the opportunity to repair the broken covenant. You have the opportunity to make the world a better place. Not for the sake of the Jewish people only, not just for the sake of Zionism, not just for the sake of Israel, but for the sake of the West, for liberal democracy, and for the UN's ideals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Troy, you referred in your speech to the speech of Ambassador Daniel Moynihan at the adoption of the resolution, and we will now hear a short excerpt from it, but I do encourage you to watch it in full when you have the chance.
Le résultat du vote est le suivant. 72 voix pour, 35 voix contre, 32 abstentions. Le projet de résolution est adopté.
The United States rises to declare before the General Assembly of the United Nations and before the world that it does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. Not 3 weeks ago, the United States representative in the Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Committee, and with what irony those terms ring on our ears today, pleaded in measured and fully considered terms for the United Nations not to do this thing. It was, he said, obscene. It is something more today, for the furtiveness with which this obscenity first appeared among us has been replaced by a shameless openness. There will be time enough to contemplate the harm this act will have done the United Nations. Historians will do that for us, and it is sufficient for the moment only to note one foreboding fact. A great evil has been loosed upon the world. Now, I should wish it to be understood that I am here making one point, and one point only, which is whatever else Zionism may be, it is not and cannot be a form of racism. In logic, the state of Israel could be, or could become, many things, theoretically including many things undesirable, but it could not be and could not become racist unless it ceased to be Zionist. The United States of America declares that it does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. Thank you, Mr. President.
And now it is my great honor to invite a lifelong activist against anti-Semitism and a very special speaker, Mr. David Harris, for his remarks.
Good morning. First, a thank you to Gregory Lafitte of Forum for Cultural Diplomacy who helped give birth to the idea of this event and worked often alone and perseverantly to make it happen, to the missions of both Israel and the United States. And I'm proud to be sitting next to the representative of the United States, particularly because it is the United States that not only helped lead the battle against the adoption of the resolution, as we've heard, but also because the United States led the effort, rare in UN history, to repeal the resolution in 1991. And the United States today, both in its fight against anti-Semitism and in its pursuit of expanding the Abraham Accords and the Circle of Peace, is showing what enlightened diplomacy can look like. And my friend Daniel Meron, the Israeli permanent representative, someone I've known for many years, and someone I'm proud to be associated with, as I'm proud all my life to be associated with the State of Israel in its search for true and abiding peace, a good night's sleep. And Gil Troy, from whom you just heard, failed to mention his own book. He asked you to read the full speeches of Ambassadors Moynihan and Herzog. I'm asking you to read his book, Moynihan's Moment, for a fuller understanding of this conversation and everything that led up to it and that followed it. And of course, Ariel Herzog has been mentioned, but as the granddaughter of Chaim Herzog and the niece of the current president, it's a great privilege to have her here as well. A word about myself, if I may, that you won't read in any resume. It's relevant. A young man at the age of 18 who was studying chemistry and physics at the University of Vienna was expelled in 1938 after the Anschluss. He escaped the Nazis and moved to France. He enlisted and was sent to the French Foreign Legion in Algeria. He spent 3 years in a special Vichy regime in Western Algeria, successfully escaping on his second attempt, joined OSS, the American Wartime Spy Service, and spent the remainder of the Second World War behind enemy lines in Austria and Yugoslavia. When he came to America after the Second World War, he understood the need for a lifelong battle, both for memory and against the forgetfulness that too often occurs, the historical amnesia. That was my father. A young woman who was born in Stalin's Soviet Union, who with her family fled Soviet anti-Semitism, which very quickly became masqueraded as anti-Zionism, and every Jew in the Soviet Union understood and knew it, and who landed in France in 1929, and by 1940 was being targeted by the occupying Nazis and their French Vichy collaborators, and spent 17 months in hiding. That was my mother. And the young woman who at the age of 16 and a half years old, living in their ancestral home in Tripoli, Libya, was faced with a mob of several hundred people who wanted to torch the home of this young woman, her 7 siblings, and her parents for one reason and one reason only, interchangeably referring to them as Jews and Zionists, because there too, it was understood the two were interchangeable. Through the miracle of one brave local Libyan Arab citizen, the family was saved, other Jews were not. They spent weeks in hiding and were given safe passage by the Italian ambassador, never to return. That was my wife, is my wife. I grew up understanding that to fight anti-Semitism, one has to be swivel-headed, 360 degrees. And I didn't learn this in Ivy-covered universities. I learned it from 3 people who never finished their education, but had PhDs in understanding the nature of hatred and prejudice and genocidal threat. And all my life, I've tried myself to go deeper and understand this more, and understood that the first challenge we have collectively is the failure of imagination. Let me take you back a few years before the resolution. April 1933, barely 2 months after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and less than 2 weeks after the enabling legislation gave him full power to bypass the parliament. The American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, said, and I quote, "Mistreatment of Jews in Germany may be considered virtually eliminated." The British Prime Minister at the time, James Ramsay MacDonald, said on November the 9th, "I do not doubt Germany's motives. I have never doubted them, and I hope I will never be hasty enough to doubt them." David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister in World War I, highly respected. He said, referring to a meeting he had in Berlin with Adolf Hitler in 1936, and I quote, "He is the George Washington of Germany, the man who won for his country independence from all her aggressors." Not to be outdone, Mackenzie King, the longtime Prime Minister of Canada, himself traveled to Germany in 1937, and he wrote in his diary, and I quote, "My sizing up was that he, Hitler, is really one who truly loves his fellow man. As I talked with him, I could not but think of Joan of Arc. He is distinctly a mystic." French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier, following the third and final meeting with Hitler in September 1938, said, and I quote, "I am certain today that thanks to the desire to make mutual concessions, and thanks to the spirit of collaboration which has animated the action of the 4 great powers," referring to Germany, Italy, Britain, and France, "peace is saved," said Edouard Daladier. And of course, there are multiple quotes from Neville Chamberlain that day. Here's one we hear less about. "I got the impression that here was a man," referring to Hitler, "who could be relied upon when he had given his word." We had a failure of imagination then. Good people, decent people, institutions, media personalities, country leaders, who simply were unwilling or incapable or both of understanding the extremist mindset. And of course, during that period, across the lake from this beautiful spot in Evian, 32 nations gathered at the behest of President Franklin Roosevelt to discuss what they referred to euphemistically as the refugee problem, unwilling even to refer to Jews as Jews. And as you know, I hope, of the 32 nations who gathered in July 1938 across this lake, 31 said, in effect, "We commiserate, but our doors are closed." The one exception being the Dominican Republic. It's not by accident, I believe, that Kristallnacht took place only a few months after Evian. Hitler understood that whatever the chancellery statements might be, the expressions of criticism of German policy, that when push came to shove, few nations would lift a finger for the Jews. It was most poignantly put, perhaps, by the Australian delegate to the Evian conference, Mr. T.W. White, who said, and I quote, as we have no real racial problem, we are not desirous of importing one, referring to the Jews. So now I fast forward from that failure of imagination, reminding us all, though I suspect no one in this room needs reminder, that while Hitler telegraphed his intent to eliminate the Jews, the result of the Second World War was as many as 60 to 70 million people who were killed, nations destroyed, tens of millions uprooted, internally displaced across borders. How many children created as orphans? How many institutions that had been betrayed as useless? And now I ask, in today's world, with anti-Semitism again rising, where is the world? And I'm not now speaking about statements. Yes, words do matter, as we heard again and again this morning, but actions matter far more than words. And I am here to say, having spent the last 50 years in global diplomacy, and though I can't fully trust my eyesight, having visited on numerous occasions every single country represented in this room, but for two, and I apologize to the representative of Monaco and Cameroon. And I hope there's still enough breath in me to correct. But every single country in this room, yes, including Iceland, on several occasions, including for the legendary Reagan-Gorbachev summit meeting held in Reykjavik, I've been engaged in global diplomacy with twin messages. Our fates are intertwined. Those who want to decouple and who believe that the fate of Israel and the fate of the Jewish people globally are somehow disconnected are making a fundamental mistake. I invite you to look at any and every country, whether in Europe, Eastern Europe in particular, whether in the Arab and larger Muslim world, where Jews were either eliminated or forced to flee, and give me one example of a country that succeeded and prospered in the wake of that. To the contrary, I would call out for you the fact that in 2015, when ISIS reared its head in Libya, and the world saw 21 Coptic Christians from Egypt kneeling on the sands, blindfolded, while Jihadi John and his colleagues wielded their machetes. I'm guessing that ISIS first looked for the Jews in Libya, but having found none because they had either all been massacred or like my wife's family, able to leave, they went after the Christians. They couldn't find the Saturday people. They went after the Sunday people. Our fates are intertwined, and sometimes I feel like the Greek mythological character Cassandra, destined because of unwanted history, excessive history, to have seen coming attractions, while nonetheless watching countries claim to be fighting anti-Semitism while sacrificing Israel and the Jewish people on the altar of political expediency or economic interests. I understand national interests. I understand there's often a clash between interests and values. But if we abandon our values, what's left of who we are and what makes us distinctive? I was a student in Great Britain on November 10th, 1975. I heard the news while studying at the London School of Economics. I remember the shock. Like Gil Troy said, I too was a big fan of the United Nations. In fact, I was in conversation with UNHCR about a possible job. I believed in the mission of the United Nations, and I was a starry-eyed idealist who wanted to help save the world. And they talked with me about a position in Khartoum, Sudan, which would have meant working with both Christians and Muslims, no Jews. It was interesting to me, appealing to me. And then came the thunderous decision of November the 10th. And I said, no, I will not sacrifice my Zionism. It's in my DNA. It's not about a particular Israeli political party. Rather, it's about Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. I cannot be a Jew disconnected from my Jewish ancestry, which is both time and place. And I understood as well that both as a Zionist and an anti-racist, among those many Jews and others who fought in the United States and sometimes gave their lives for civil rights, marched, facing the bull connors, facing the whips, I understood that this was a defamation, yes, of the Jewish people, but above all, of the 72 nations that voted for it for whatever expedient reason they did. And that's why, as Gil mentioned, I felt that this had to be overturned. Many Israelis thought it's a mosquito bite. We've had them before, we'll have them again. It'll go away. In Hebrew, you refer to the UN as So many dismissed it as shmum. It doesn't matter. It mattered. It mattered in Britain, where the National Union of Students immediately moved to try and delegitimize the Jewish Union of Students, ipso facto, for their connection to Israel. It mattered throughout the world, wherever we went in our diplomatic missions. We saw the impact of those three words: Zionism is racism. It took 16 years. And fortunately, as I mentioned, under the leadership of President George H.W. Bush, and by the way, I would add, with the support of the Soviet Union. Times had changed in the very last days of the Soviet Union, and with the support of many ex-republics of the Soviet Union and ex-satellite states of the Soviet Union, it overwhelmingly was adopted. But finally, as has been said from this podium, the impact of those words has not disappeared, though it has been repealed from 3379. And my plea to you is not about whether you like a particular Israeli government or not, or whether your best friends are Jews or not, but to understand that anti-Semitism is a cancer. Left unchecked, it will metastasize. It is endlessly elastic. I was asked by Oxford University Press to write a book on the subject, which just came out last month. And what I discovered in researching the book, much as I thought I understood the subject, was that the ancient tropes used against the Jews, those endlessly elastic tropes which allow us to be both capitalists and communists, both white and non-white, both the insiders, you said, Gil, and the outsider, are now being superimposed upon the Jewish state. You may or may not realize it, but because there's a ready-made audience in too many places in the world because of the embedding of anti-Semitism in both Muslim and Christian civilization, there's a huge audience prepared to believe any and all assertions, conspiracy theories. And if only Joseph Goebbels had had social media as we have it today, it's frightening to think what the consequences would be. Please, those of you representing countries, do not suffer from a failure of imagination. Do not allow someone 20, 30, 40 years from now to bring his index cards and quote your countries as having misunderstood the moment. Please understand that for the sake not only of us, but of our collective cherished values, we must prevail. We have no choice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris, and thank you, Professor Troy. And I would like to thank all our speakers before we turn to the room for statements. So thank you very much. So now we would like to turn to the audience for any statements and questions, and I would like to invite the ambassador of Hungary, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And first, I would like to thank the missions of Israel and the United States for organizing this very, very important event, and also the speakers for their invaluable insights. Thank you very much for that. Hungary reaffirms its unwavering commitment to combating anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of intolerance. We recall that the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3379, which equated Zionism with racism, represented a grave misjudgment and caused a deep pain in Jewish communities around the world. Its revocation in 1991 was a necessary act of moral and political correction. Today, we are once again witnessing a worrying resurgence of anti-Semitic rhetoric and racially motivated hatred across Europe and beyond, both online and offline. Hungary unequivocally condemns all manifestations of anti-Semitism and consistently stands up against such hatred in every form. In international fora, Hungary has been a steadfast supporter of Israel and continues to advocate for fair, balanced, and constructive dialogue. We highly appreciate President Trump's leadership in the Abraham Accords and the Gaza ceasefire agreement, which made possible the last Hungarian hostage to return. In our country, Hungary maintains a zero tolerance policy towards anti-Semitism. Demonstrations glorifying terrorist organizations are strictly prohibited and unthinkable. It is telling that in Hungary, Jewish community events do not require armed security, reflecting the sense of safety and mutual respect in our society. The fact that Central Europe's largest synagogue and its largest Catholic church stand within walking distance of each other serves as a powerful symbol of peaceful coexistence. Hungary remains deeply concerned about the persistence of anti-Israel bias and unbalanced narratives in certain international fora. We are proud to stand as Israel's strategic ally and steadfast friend. Israel can always count on Hungary's support in the global fight against anti-Semitism and against unfair, politically motivated attacks. We firmly believe that combating anti-Semitism requires political will and commitment at the highest level. All governments must declare and uphold the policy of zero tolerance toward anti-Semitism, ensuring that such hatred has no place in our societies or in international discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Are there any further questions or statements from the floor? If not, I will break the ice a little bit for a discussion with our panel and ask Mr. Harris and Mr. Troy and anybody else who wants to contribute. If you can, you both spoke about it a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate on how the adoption of this resolution impacted negatively the genuine fight against racism, which is so crucial for the nations, please.
If we go to 1975, right, first of all, let's remember it's only 30 years after the end of the Holocaust. So the Jewish people are still traumatized. But also, as my friend David Harris had, my teacher, David Harris pointed out, the United States of America had also gone through an extraordinary transformation, partially because of the forces and the idealism released by the fight against totalitarianism and Nazi racism in World War II. And while there was still work to do, the United States of America, through the civil rights movement and through presidential leadership, had started its own, as we would say in Hebrew, tikkun, its own reform. And so there was a greater awareness of the ugliness of racism, and that it was not just, and one of the genius moves of Martin Luther King was to frame it not just as a fight for Black dignity, not just a fight for Black equality, but to quote the Constitution and quote the Bible and quote the Declaration of Independence and say this is a fight for basic humanity. And so in 1975, there was a great awareness of how ugly racism is, built on the trauma from the Nazi Holocaust, and then built on the new awareness that even the United States of America had work to do and was making its reforms. So then to take that word and weaponize it and cheapen it and drain it of its meaning was truly terrifying to Blacks, truly terrifying to activists who had seen how important it was to kind of say, yes, look, we're well aware of the fact that there's an ugly reality called bigotry in the world. And there's an ugly fact that while we all, what is the United Nations? We all define ourselves by boundaries. We all want nationalism as a way of organizing our lives. And that sometimes when we create a national perspective, we also sometimes demonize the other. And so it was very important to go beyond that and to say we can have a nationalism with a right wing and a left wing that soars. A nationalism with a first name and a middle name, liberal democratic nationalism. A nationalism that's not about racism. And so then to take that and turn it against Israel, turn it against Zionism, and as Moynihan said, you're taking the least form, the least racist form, the least nationalist form of nationalism in many ways, the least blood-based, was actually a real distortion. And we saw again and again. So the two problems were, one, the cheapening of that word and the cheapening of the whole language of human rights. And they warned that it would indeed be this obscenity, but they also warned that it would start a whole process of Israel always being at the center of the world's trouble.
Elizabeth, I would just add something that maybe goes unspoken in public settings in the United Nations, but that I've heard many, many times, including when I was invited by then Secretary of State Colin Powell to be a delegate to the Durban Conference, U.S. delegate to the Durban Conference. And that is that the true challenges of racism have largely gone unaddressed because of the hijacking of the racism agenda by the obsessed anti-Zionist, anti-Israel community of nations within the United Nations. And time permitting, I could recall many conversations, particularly with African political leaders and diplomats before Durban, after Durban, saying, what about us? What about our priorities? What about our concerns? Every time we go to one of these meetings expecting to be able to air our very legitimate grievances, concerns, proposals, we find that the time is being taken up, the oxygen is being pulled out of the room by this 24/7 anti-Israel machinery. So if the question is, how has racism been hurt? It's been hurt in the ways that Gil just explained, and it's been hurt in the fact that much more time and attention could and should have been addressed to legitimate issues, but the majority of nations in the UN bodies, plural, allowed the hijacking to take place. And I dare say, though it's not for me, it's time to take back the majority and reassert the legitimate priorities in the fields of combating racism and racial discrimination.
Thank you very much. I will return to the public if there are any other questions or statements. I think there are not. Maybe a quick round of closing words, just a few words to round off this important event, please.
Thank you, Elisabetta. I heard Professor Troy talk about how much Americans believed in the UN, and I've been part of, and I still am part of those who believe in the UN. I've seen more of the corridors of New York than I've seen of the corridors of Geneva, the UN. But I can say that I've seen many good people who have who believe in the goals of the UN and want to do everything they can to further them, to go in the right direction. And I had the honor of initiating the recognition of Yom Kippur at the United Nations, and I saw the support that every time I tried to talk about it with someone in the UN Secretariat, we had all the support. At the time, it was Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and I must recognize that it was thanks to the United States and the Deputy Secretary General of the time, Jan Eliasson, that we obtained this recognition. And so I believe completely in the United Nations. I think the United Nations is, what else do we have? But we have to understand that there's, in 1975, and we see it today, when we see the rise of anti-Semitism. You know, when you heard some of the statements made in 1975, some were beautiful statements against the resolution. Some were awful, just statements reeking of anti-Semitism. And I don't want to quote some of the representatives then, because I don't even understand how they could say such things, which are, there was no doubt, if you read them, it is anti-Semitism. But today, when we see this resurgence of anti-Semitism, there's nothing shocking anymore about this. When you hear what is being said in the streets, when you hear what is being written on social media, I think somehow it's this poison that when we think that the UN was created on the ashes of the Holocaust, that it would end up with this poison that is then accepted by everyone today and just tolerated. We need to collectively do something. And I do not want to abandon the UN. I believe it would be important to do something to, like I said in my introductory remarks, to rewrite this resolution. And I'll just end by saying that the idea of recognizing Yom Kippur came from a resolution on the day of Pesach, which is a great resolution. And in that resolution, it says it recognizes the millennial contributions of Buddhism to the world, to humanity. And I thought, why can't we have that kind of resolution on Judaism, on Zionism, on the Jewish culture? Why can we have a resolution in the UNGA about Buddhism, which is wonderful to recognize this, but not on the Jewish culture? And I think that's where the issue is. And I helped launch in New York group of Friends of Jewish Culture, and we're trying to see what can be done to not just to repeal a resolution, but really to ignite something else, to show that there's nothing shameful about Jewish culture. It's this thread that is so important for, I believe, all of us and all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Zieseniss, maybe a few words?
Sure. I will close by thanking you again for your partnership in this event. And thanks to everybody who's here today to listen to take part in this conversation. And I will just echo what we've been hearing. The theme all morning is that it's more than just words, right? This is a call to action for everybody in this room, everybody who's not in this room. We have to take action. And so I hope that this conversation is just one more step in that direction. And I'll just leave it at that, but I'm hopeful.
Thank you very much. Mr. Harris?
I don't know if you noticed at the back of the screen when we saw Daniel Patrick Moynihan speaking, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time of the adoption of Resolution 3379. If you happen to miss it, our friend from Vienna did not, I'm sure. It was Kurt Waldheim, which itself speaks volumes, perhaps, given how he hid his own Nazi history during the Second World War. But the final point I'd like to make is to those who still try to make these very intellectual, scholarly distinctions between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, thinking that somehow there is a space that can divide these two and protect them from accusations, or their countries from accusations of anti-Semitism. A friend of both Giltroy and myself, Natan Sharansky, the prisoner of conscience for 9 years in the Soviet Gulag, offered a very convenient and I think very useful guide to when criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitism, as opposed to the legitimate criticism that any democratic country invites, experiences, suffers. And one of the 3 Ds, in addition to double standards and demonization, was delegitimization. I invite you, distinguished diplomats, to think about this. There are 193 member states of the United Nations. The so-called legitimacy of 192 is not in question. Although one could easily argue, if one wished, that there are very good questions to be raised about the legitimacy of most nations that we speak of today, including my own, the United States, or why my wife's native country, Libya, is ruled by Arabs who come from thousands of miles away, just like neighboring Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, or how states like Jordan and Iraq were created. I can go down a very long list of nations and question their legitimacy, but for the fact that they exist. Ergo, they have a right to exist, except for Israel. And yet, if one wants to look at so-called legitimacy arguments from the Hebrew Bible to the Christian Bible, even to the Quran, which more than 40 times mentions the Bani Israel, the children of Israel, the Quran, from thousands of years back to the Balfour Declaration, the San Remo Conference, the League of Nations, the 1947 UN Resolution 181, to Israel's very membership in this body in 1949. I'll put Israel's case for legitimacy up against any nation on earth. And therefore, to deny uniquely and singularly the Jewish people's quest not for conquest, not for colonization, but for liberation and decolonization, to me, smacks of anti-Semitism. And those who think they can mask their virulent anti-Semitism by instead superimposing it under the name anti-Zionism aren't going to get away with it. And I urge you, the next time you're in discussion or debate, to ask yourself, to borrow from Gil's words again, what is this obsession? Israel is not a perfect country, and I think none of us are here to defend Israel as a perfect country any more than Switzerland is a perfect country. Ask the descendants of the victims of Auschwitz how easy it was to get the assets in Switzerland from Swiss banks that demanded death certificates in order to release bank holdings. And I can go down a very long list. It's not to indict any country. It's simply to say that Israel, a liberal democracy, the only liberal democracy in the region, is imperfect, but has every right not just to exist, thank you very much, but to live, to thrive, and to be an active contributing member to the United Nations. And when the United Nations walls off Israel, it's hurting itself in countless ways. You want to help foster development? Enlist Israel's help. Drip irrigation, water management. I can go down a long list, and Daniel can give you an even longer list. You're hurting yourselves. The UN is hurting itself in the fight against racism, in the fight for sustainable development. It's time to show a bit more values-oriented diplomacy in the United Nations system, I believe, for the sake of us all.
Thank you. To follow up on that, if homicide is killing a human being and suicide is killing yourself, this delegitimization that David's talking about is historicide. They don't just want to kill us, but they want to kill our history. They want to negate our 3,500-year-old ties to the land. And that's very dangerous and that's toxic. And once you start doing that, and once history becomes putty in everybody's hands, then it doesn't just hurt us. It hurts everyone. And I think that's the theme of this morning, that this isn't just something that happened to the Jewish people, isn't just something that happened to Zionism, isn't just something that happened to Israel. And by the way, if we go to New York and see some of the things that are happening in New York City today, I want to evoke a more positive moment in New York's history. The day after the Zionism is Racism resolution passed. And again, the great pride that we as New Yorkers had in that extraordinary building that was put up in Turtle Bay was shattered. And they said, let's call a rally. But they were nervous. Maybe New Yorkers wouldn't show up, and so they called it a youth rally. Because they said, if 10,000 people showed up, then we can call it a success. 100,000 people showed up that day. Blacks and whites, left and right, Jews and non-Jews, many of them sporting a little button saying, I am a Zionist to take back the night. The head of B'nai B'rith, David Blumberg, got up and echoing, Black is beautiful, said, Zionism is beautiful. And the crowd cheered. And then Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King's right-hand man who helped organize the 1963 March on Washington, got up, warned again about the hijacking of the word racism, the demeaning of the currency. And then looking at this amazing crowd, sang, when Israel was in Egypt's land, and 100,000 people yelled, let my people go, and let our people go. And if I may finish with a personal plea, if you notice, there was something anomalous in Daniel Patrick Moynihan's speech. He spoke after the resolution passed. Why? Because he had fought it so harshly, so effectively, that he knew that if he spoke before, people would say, oh, the reason why it passed was because people wanted to knock him down, because he wouldn't tone down his words, because he was being undiplomatic. And when he was told to tone down, he said, what is this phrase, toning down, when you're faced with an outright lie about the United States or about Israel or Zionism? And we go in and say, this is not true. Now, how do you tone that down? Do you say it's only half untrue? What kind of people are we? What kind of people do they think we are? They know it's not true. The way he described this entire fight against Zionism as racism is he said an issue of honor, of morality was put before us and not all of us ran. He said a diplomat, yes, occasionally learns how to hobnob and speak beautifully and speak diplomatically. But that's only one of the many arrows in the diplomat's quiver. And occasionally you need moral outrage and moral clarity. Occasionally you need to assert power. You need to use different kinds of tools in order to be effective. And so I'm a professor, I give you homework. When I first was tenured, the dean of the McGill's Law School said, if you don't, I'll be elegant, anger people once a year, you've wasted your tenure. Break out of the diplomatic box every now and then. Break out of the polite demands of society. Every now and then decide this isn't the moment to tone down. This is the moment to stand up. And this is a first step in that. Thank you very much.
Daniel, can I just say one thing before you go on? The next time any of you may be in New York at the United Nations building, you're not going to be able to see it well, but some of you may recognize the vertical sculpture called Single Form in front of the Secretariat building when you enter and you go around the fountain, the circle of water, to reach the Secretariat building where the Secretary General and others have their offices. Please remember from this meeting that the sculptor Barbara Hepworth and the sculpture were a gift to the then young United Nations from Jacob Blaustein, who was the president of the American Jewish Committee, the organization with which I worked for 43 years. When we say here that we were young believers in the world body, this is proof positive of just how much we wanted to believe in the world body. And if you have just one extra moment during your busy day in New York, cross First Avenue to Isaiah's wall and look there at the words of the Hebrew prophet, Lo yisagoy el goy cherev, lo yilmadu od milchama. And it's inscribed there opposite the UN, and nation shall not lift up sword against nation, nor shall they learn war anymore. Look at the sculpture, look at Isaiah's wall, and please, please, please remember this meeting and the messages we tried to convey. Thank you, Daniel.
In the last 2 years, since 7th of October, Israel has been fighting a very, very difficult war that was forced on us, a war that we fought on 7 different fronts. But actually, there was an 8th front. The 8th front was in the world, and especially here at the UN. And that was a fight against the narrative that was permeating here, the Hamas narrative. And that we had to fight daily against the attempt to sideline Israel and to put it on the, to accuse it of committing the worst crimes, the crimes of genocide, etc. And we have been defending Israel day in, day out here at the UN and trying to explain what we're doing and why we're doing it. And as David Harris said here, Israel has so much to give to the world and to contribute here at the UN. It doesn't want to walk out of the UN. It wants to be a contributing member of this organization. I was very, very pleased to see just a few weeks ago, we had here in this building a commemoration of 7th of October, and you all participated. We have representatives of more than 50 countries that came to commemorate with Israel. So while there is an attempt to sideline Israel, to single out Israel, that is not succeeding. When I was a young diplomat, I asked my superiors, why is it that there are so many resolutions against one country, against Israel? Why is it that Israel is singled out with special sessions and special items against Israel, but not against any other country? And my superior said to me, don't you understand? We are sui generis. We are a special country, and not always for the better at the UN. And we are treated differently than other countries. And that is something that we have to bring to your attention and to expose to everyone. We want normalcy. There's a famous Israeli writer, A.B. Yehoshua, who wrote once a book called B'zchut HaNormaliyut, in the name of normalcy. And we want to be normal. We want to be a normal country, be treated. If we make mistakes, discuss it with us. But we also want to contribute, and we can contribute so much, and we will continue to do that here at the UN. A few months ago, Gregory Lafitte, founding director of the Forum for Cultural Diplomacy, came to me with the suggestion to have this meeting here today. And I'm so pleased, Gregory, that you came up with the idea. And I'm so thankful to the United States mission in Geneva that was our partner to it. It's a great honor and pleasure to have here with us such outstanding speakers. David Harris, who was the leader of the American Jewish Committee for so many years and such a fighter against anti-Semitism. And Professor Giltroy, who has come here from New York, but is really also a Jerusalemite like myself. You contributed so much to this event. I also want to thank my mission here, the Israeli mission in Geneva, my deputies here, Anat, and of course, Rebecca Goba, who is our head of our public diplomacy, and of course, our human rights experts and our moderator today, Elisabetta Zeidman, and our intern, Oren, for all putting together this event, which has been broadcast live to thousands around the world. Thank you very much for all joining us here today.